The wind in the alley was a razor, slicing through the threadbare wool of Alara's coat. It carried the stench of stagnant water and rot, a smell she had come to associate with the end of things. Her mother was gone, taken by a fever that had swept through the shanties like a prairie fire, leaving behind only a hollow silence and this gnawing, relentless cold. Now there was only the town of Redemption, a place that offered none. Mud, hardened by the encroaching frost, clung to the hem of her dress. Each shivering breath was a small, white flag of surrender she refused to wave. She was 8 years old, and the world had already proven itself a brute. Peering from the alley's mouth, she watched the light spill from the saloon doors, a garish golden promise of warmth that felt as distant as the moon. Inside there was noise, food, life. Outside there was only her. Fear was a stone in her belly, but hunger was a sharper pain. She took a breath, the frigid air searing her lungs, and pushed herself from the shadows. The saloon hit her senses like a physical blow. The air, thick with the fug of sweat, cheap whiskey, and frying fat, was a noxious blanket she willingly wrapped herself in. A piano clattered a tune devoid of joy, its notes lost beneath the braying laughter of prospectors and tired, angry men. Faces turned towards her, a sea of suspicion and annoyance. A child, a girl, did not belong here. She was a smudge of grime on their grimy escape. Her eyes scanned the room, darting past the painted woman with a brittle smile and the card players whose knuckles were white with tension. She was looking for a face that held something other than contempt or avarice. Then she saw him. He sat alone at a small table in the corner, a bulwark of stillness in the room's chaotic tide. His shoulders were broad, his hands calloused and resting on either side of a half-empty glass. He wasn't drinking so much as staring into the amber liquid, as if searching for a memory. His face was a landscape carved by hardship, his eyes holding a profound, settled grief that she recognized. It was the same hollowed-out look she had seen in her own reflection in a puddle that morning. The townsfolk whispered about him. Silas, the widower from the ridge, who had lost his wife and child to the same winter that had almost claimed the whole territory 2 years prior. He spoke to no one, and no one spoke to him. He was an island of sorrow. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. This was a desperate, foolish plan, born of a child's logic where need overwrites reason. He was alone. She was alone. Perhaps their solitudes could fit together. She moved, a small shadow weaving through the forest of chair legs, until she stood before his table. He did not look up. She could see the faint tremor in his hand, the only sign of the life still churning beneath his granite exterior. She had to force the words past the lump of terror in her throat. Her voice was a dry, rustling sound, barely audible above the din. "Are you my pa?" He flinched. It was not a large movement, but a tightening of his entire being, as if her small voice had been a branding iron pressed to his soul. For a long, terrible moment, he remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the glass. Alara's hope, a fragile seedling, began to wither. She had been wrong. This was a place of broken men, and she had just prodded the most broken of them all. She could feel the eyes of the room on her now, the sneering curiosity of the bartender, the dismissive glances of the patrons. Laughter, sharp and cruel, pricked the air. But then, slowly, Silas lifted his head. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met hers. They held no warmth, no welcome, but they held no cruelty either. They simply saw her. They saw the chapped lips, the dirt smudged on her cheek, the desperate hunger that was more than a plea for food. He looked at her for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable. He did not speak. He did not smile or scowl. Instead, he reached into his waistcoat pocket, his movements deliberate, and pulled out a coin. With a flick of his thumb, he sent it spinning onto the bar. It landed with a sharp, definitive clink that cut through the noise. He jerked his chin toward the bartender. "Stew," he said. The word was rough and used, like a stone dragged from dry earth. It was not an answer. It was not an invitation. But it was not a rejection. It was a reprieve. The bartender, a fleshy man named Jebediah with eyes like polished river stones, grumbled but scooped a ladle of thick, greasy stew into a wooden bowl and slid it down the bar. Alara scurried to retrieve it, her hands trembling so badly she nearly spilled it. She brought it back to the table and Silas had already shifted, making a small space for her on the bench. She sat, not beside him, but near him, in the small circle of quiet he commanded. She ate with a desperation that bordered on pain, the hot stew scalding her tongue. She did not care. It was warmth. It was life. He watched her, his face impassive, but his gaze never left her until the bowl was scraped clean. Then he stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow over her. He placed his hat on his head and, without a word, walked to the door. For a paralyzing second, Alara thought he was leaving her there. But he paused at the threshold, his back to her, and waited. It was all the invitation she would get. She scrambled from the bench and followed his silhouette out into the biting wind, leaving the jeering warmth of the saloon behind for the uncertain shelter of a stranger's grief. The walk to his homestead was a silent pilgrimage. The moon was a sliver of bone in the ink-black sky, offering little light to guide them up the winding, rock-strewn path that led to the ridge. Silas moved with a steady, ground-eating stride, never once looking back to see if she was following. He did not offer a hand on the steep parts, nor did he slow his pace. His silence was a wall, and Alara understood she was not to breach it. She simply had to keep up. The homestead, when they reached it, was as stark and quiet as the man himself. A small, solid cabin built of dark timber stood against the wind, a plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney in a lonely thread. A weathered barn leaned nearby, and a few bare-limbed aspens shivered in the darkness. There was no welcome here, only an austere, unyielding existence. Inside, the cabin was one room, meticulously clean but empty of comfort. A fire crackled in the hearth, its light dancing on a simple cot, a sturdy table, and 2 chairs. On the mantelpiece, a single framed photograph caught the flickering light. A woman with a gentle smile and a small child, a boy, bundled in her arms. Silas's lost world, captured in silver nitrate. He gestured toward the hearth. "Warm yourself," he commanded softly, then turned to tend to his horse, leaving her alone in the charged silence of his home. Alara edged closer to the fire, soaking in the heat. This was not a home. It was a shrine to what was gone. Over the next days, a new routine settled, unspoken and unnegotiated. She slept on a pallet of blankets he laid out near the fire each night. He never tucked her in, never spoke a word of comfort, but the blankets were always there. He would rise before the sun, and she would wake to the smell of wood smoke and chicory. Their days were measured by chores. He taught her, through gesture and sparse, one-word commands, how to split kindling, how to draw clean water from the well, how to mend a tear in her own worn dress with the needle and thread he left on the table. Their communication was a language of shared tasks and observed actions. She learned the specific rhythm of his axe striking wood, the way he paused to scan the horizon as if expecting someone who would never arrive. She learned that his silence was not always anger. Sometimes, it was a deep, internal listening. He, in turn, seemed to learn her. He started leaving a second biscuit on the plate in the morning. He carved a small, crude bird from a piece of scrap wood and left it by her pallet. He never acknowledged the gift, nor did she, but she clutched it in her hand as she slept. A storm rolled in from the north one afternoon, a furious squall of wind and sleet that rattled the cabin's lone window. It trapped them inside, forcing them into a proximity that was almost uncomfortable. The wind howled like a grieving animal, a sound that mirrored the desolation in Silas's eyes. He sat at the table, sharpening a knife with long, methodical strokes, his focus absolute. Alara, huddled by the fire, watched him, her fear of the storm less than her fascination with this man. She saw the way his knuckles were white as he gripped the knife, the tension in his jaw. He was not just fighting the storm outside, but one within. She felt a strange, fierce protectiveness rise in her. She had come here seeking a father, but what she was finding was a fellow survivor. That night, the storm still raging, she woke from a nightmare. A silent scream caught in her throat. Silas was already awake, sitting on his cot, staring into the dying embers. He didn't look at her, but he spoke into the darkness, his voice low and raspy. "The wind will pass." It was the first full sentence he had ever offered her. A simple statement of fact that felt like a profound promise. The truce they had forged with the world was a fragile thing. Alara knew this. Redemption was a town that fed on weakness, and their quiet arrangement on the ridge was a curiosity that had festered into suspicion. Jebediah, the saloon owner, was the sort who mistook silence for meekness and solitude for an opportunity. He had seen the way Silas had paid for her stew, the protective set of his shoulders as they left. He saw a lonely man, a plot of land with a good well, and a girl who was a loose thread that could be pulled to unravel it all. He arrived on a Tuesday, the sky a pitiless, glaring blue. He was not alone. With him was a stooped, rat-faced man from the town council, a man whose piety was a thin veneer over his greed. They rode up to the cabin, their horses trampling the small patch of hardy herbs Alara had been tending. Silas was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only sound. He did not stop as they dismounted. He finished the swing, burying the axe head deep into the splitting block, and only then did he turn to face them. Alara watched from the doorway, the carved bird clutched in her hand, her heart a cold, heavy stone. "Silas," Jebediah began, his voice oozing a false congeniality. "Town has concerns." About the girl, Silas remained silent, his gaze flat and hard. He wiped a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm. "It ain't right," the councilman chimed in, avoiding Silas's eyes. "A girl needs a proper home, an orphanage. Not this." He gestured vaguely at the stark cabin, at the untamed wilderness stretching behind it. The unspoken accusation hung in the air, that this place, this man, was unfit. Jebediah stepped forward, his smile turning into a sneer. "We're here to take her. It's for her own good. Unless you'd care to make a donation. For her upkeep, say, the deed to this patch of rock." The threat was laid bare. This wasn't about her welfare. It was about land, about power, about breaking the man who refused to be broken. For a moment, Alara thought Silas would shatter. She saw a flicker of the old, raw grief in his eyes, the agony of loss threatening to overwhelm him. But then something else settled in its place. It was not rage. It was a terrifying, absolute stillness. He pulled the axe from the block with one smooth motion, its polished head gleaming in the sun. He didn't raise it as a weapon. He simply held it, its weight comfortable in his hand. He took a single step forward, and the two men flinched back. "She stays," Silas said. The words were not loud, but they carried the immense, unshakable weight of the mountain behind them. Jebediah's bravado faltered. He looked from Silas's unyielding face to the axe, and the calculation in his eyes shifted from greed to self-preservation. Just then, Alara moved. She stepped out from the doorway and stood, not behind Silas, but beside him. Her hand was still clenched around the wooden bird, but her chin was up, her small face set with a defiance that mirrored his. She didn't say a word. She just stood her ground, a tiny, unwavering ally. The sight of them together, the big, silent man and the small, fierce girl, a united front of jagged edges and shared resolve, was more potent than any weapon. Jebediah sputtered, his threats turning to bluster. He took another step back, mounted his horse clumsily, and, with a final hateful glare, rode away, the councilman scurrying behind him. The dust settled. The silence that returned was different. It was not empty. It was earned. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the air in the cabin shifted. The quiet was no longer a barrier of grief but a shared space of peace. The threat had passed, and in facing it together, they had forged something stronger than the simple arrangement of survival. That evening, as they sat at the table for their meal of rabbit stew and hard biscuits, Silas did something he had never done before. He looked directly at her, his storm-gray eyes holding hers for a long moment. There was no grand pronouncement, no declaration. There was only a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition that passed between them without the need for clumsy words. He saw her, not as a reminder of the child he had lost, but as the child who had stayed. After the meal, he walked to the mantelpiece. He picked up the silver-framed photograph of his wife and son, his thumb gently tracing the glass. Alara watched, her breath held. She thought he might put it away, finally letting go. Instead, he shifted it slightly to the left. Then, he picked up the small, crude bird he had carved for her from its place on her palette and set it on the mantel, right beside the photograph. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it changed the geography of the entire room. Changed everything. He was making a space for her, not just in his home, but in his life. He was placing her present alongside his past. Alara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. She had come to this place whispering a desperate question, looking for a father to save her from the world. She had not found a father, not in the way the stories told it. She had found something quieter, and perhaps truer. She had found a partner in the stubborn business of living. She had found a man who did not try to replace what he had lost, but who was willing to build something new upon the foundations of his sorrow. She had found resilience. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm, one of building, not just enduring. They worked side by side, mending the barn roof, clearing stones from a small plot of land for a spring garden. He would hand her a tool, and she would take it, their hands sometimes brushing, a fleeting contact that spoke volumes. One crisp morning, as they worked to repair a section of fence, he paused, looking at the small, determined set of her jaw as she struggled to wrap a wire. He reached over, his large, calloused hand guiding hers. "Like this, Alara," he said, his voice still rough, but gentle. It was the first time he had used her name, and in that single word, a future was planted. Two small, solitary figures against a vast, indifferent landscape. They were no longer just survivors. They were a family, forged not of blood, but of shared silence, mutual defense, and the quiet, stubborn refusal to be broken.